36. The impenetrable black shroud in which Albinus now lived infused an element of austerity and even of nobility into his thoughts and feelings. He was separated by darkness from that former life which had been suddenly extinguished at its sharpest bend. Remembered scenes peopled the picture gallery of his mind. Margot in a figured apron, drawing aside a purple curtain. How he yearned for its dingy color now. Margot under the shining umbrella tipping through crimson puddles. Margot naked in front of the wardrobe mirror, gnawing at a yellow roll. Margot in her glistening bathing suit throwing a ball. Margot in a silvery evening gown with her sunburned shoulders. Then he thought about his wife, and his wife with her seemed now to be steeped in a pale, subdued light, and only occasionally did something emerge from this milky haze. Her fair hair in the lamp glow, the light on the picture frame, Irma playing with glass marbles, and rainbow in every one, then haze again, and Elizabeth's quiet, almost floating movements. Everything, even what was saddest and most shameful in his past life, was overlaid with the deceptive charm of colors. He was horrified to realize how little he had used his eyes, for these colors moved across too vague a background, and their outlines were singularly blurred. If, for instance, he recalled the landscape in which he had once lived, he could not name a single plant except oaks and roses, nor a single bird save sparrows and crows, and even those were more akin to heraldry than nature. Albinus now became conscious that he had not really been different from a certain narrow specialist at whom he used to scoff, from the workman who knows only his tools, or the virtuoso who is only a fleshy accessory of his violin. Albinus's specialty had been his passion for art. His most brilliant discovery had been Margot, but now all that was left of her was a voice, a rustle, and a perfume. It was as though she had returned to the darkness of the little cinema from which he had once withdrawn her. But Albinus could not always console himself with aesthetic or moral reflections, could not always succeed in convincing himself that physical blindness was spiritual vision. In vain did he try to cheat himself with the fancy that his life with Margot was now happier, deeper, and purer, and in vain did he concentrate on the thought of her touching devotion. Of course it was touching, of course she was better than most loyal life. This invisible Margot, this angelic coolness, this voice which begged him not to excite himself. But no sooner had he seized on her hand in the darkness, no sooner did he try to express his gratitude, than there was suddenly kindled in him such a longing to see her that all his moralizing dissolved away. Rex was very fond of sitting in a room with him and watching his movements. Margot, as she pressed herself to the blind man's breast, pushing away at his shoulder, would cast up her eyes to the ceiling with a comical expression of resignation, or put out her tongue at Albinus. This was particularly amusing in contrast with the wild and tender expression of the blind man's face. Then Margot freed herself by a dexterous movement, and retreated toward Rex, who was seated at the window-sill, in white trousers, with his long-toed feet and his torso bare. He loved roasting his back in the sun. Albinus reclined in an armchair, clad in his pajamas and dressing-gown. His face was covered with bristly hair. A pink scar glistened on his temple. He looked like a bearded convict. "Margot, come to me," he said imploringly, stretching out his arms. Now and then Rex, who loved taking risks, went up quite close to Albinus on the tips of his bare toes, and touched him with the utmost delicacy. Albinus uttered an affectionate purring sound, and tried to embrace the supposed Margot, while Rex sidestepped noiselessly and went back to the window-sill, his habitual perch. "My darling, do come to me," groaned Albinus, floundering out of his armchair and waddling toward her. Rex on the window-sill still drew up his legs, and Margot screamed at Albinus, declaring that she would leave him at once with a nurse if he did not do as she told him. So he shuffled back to his seat with a guilty grin. All right, he sighed. "Read something aloud to me. The paper." She once more cast her eyes to the ceiling. Rex seated himself cautiously on the sofa and took Margot on his knees. She spread out her newspaper, and after patting it and poring it over it, began to read aloud. Albinus nodded his head now and then, slowly consumed invisible cherries, spitting the invisible stones into his fist. Rex mimicked Margot, pursing his lips, and then drawing them in again as she did when she was reading, or he pretended he was just going to let her fall, so that suddenly her voice would jump, and she had to search for the end of the snapped sentence. "Yes, perhaps it's all for the best," thought Albinus. "Our love is now purer and loftier. If she sticks to me now, it means that she really loves me. That is good, that is good." And suddenly he began to sob aloud. He wrung his hands and begged her to take him to another specialist. to a third, to a fourth, an operation, torture, anything that might restore his sight. Rex, with a silent yawn, took a handful of cherries from the bowl on the table and departed to the garden. During the first days of their life together, Rex and Margot were cautious enough, although they indulged in various harmless jests. Before the door leading to his room into the corridor, Rex had erected, in case of emergency, a barricade of boxes and trunks over which Margot clambered at night. However, after his first stroll through the house, Albinus was no longer interested in the topography of it, but he had quite got his bearings in the bedroom and his study. Margot described all the colors to him. The blue wallpaper, the yellow blinds, but egged on by Rex, she changed all the colors. The fact that the blind man was obliged to picture his little world in the hues prescribed by Rex afforded the latter quite exquisite amusement. In his own rooms, Albinus almost had the feeling that he could see the furniture and the various objects, and this gave him a sense of security. But when he was sitting in the garden, he felt himself surrounded by a vast unknown, because everything was too big, too unsubstantial, and too full of sounds to enable him to form a picture of it. He tried to sharpen his hearing and to divine movements from sound. Soon it became quite difficult for Rex to come in or go out unnoticed. No matter how noiselessly he passed, Albinus turned his head at once in that direction and asked, "Is that you, darling?" And he was vexed at his miscalculation if Margot answered him from quite another corner. The days passed, and the more keenly Albinus strained his hearing, the more daring did Rex and Margot become. They had accustomed themselves to the safety curtain of his blindness, and instead of having his meals under the adoring dumb gaze of old Amelia in the kitchen, as he had done at first, Rex now contrived to sit at table with both of them. He ate with a masterly noiselessness, never touching his plate with his knife or fork, and munching like a silent film diner, in perfect rhythm with Albinus's moving jaws, to the bright music of Margot's voice, who purposefully talked very loudly while the men chewed and swallowed. Once he choked himself. Albinus, for whom Margot was pouring out a cup of coffee, suddenly heard at the far end of the table a strange bursting sound, an ignoble sputter. Margot promptly began to chatter, but he interrupted her, his hand raised. "What was that? What was that?" Rex had taken his plate and moved away on tiptoe, holding the napkin to his mouth. But as he was slipping through the half-open door, he dropped a fork. Albinus swung round in his chair. "What's that? Who's there?" he repeated. "Oh, it's only Amelia. Why are you so jumpy? But she never comes in here." "Well, today she did. I thought that my ears were beginning to get hallucinations," said Albinus. "Yesterday, for instance, I had the most definite impression that someone was stealing barefoot along the corridor." "You'll go out of your mind if you're not careful," said Margot dryly. In the afternoon, during Albinus's usual nap, she would sometimes go for a stroll with Rex. They fetched the letters and newspapers from the post office or climbed up to the waterfall, and a couple of times went to a cafe in the pretty little town lower down. Once, as they were returning to the house and already tackling the steep footpath which led to the cottage, Rex said, "I advise you not to insist on marriage. I'm very much afraid that just because he deserted his wife he has to come to look upon her as a precious saint painted on glass. He will not care to smash that particular church window. It's a simpler and better plan to get hold of his fortune gradually." "Well, we've collected quite a large bit of it, haven't we?" "We must get him to sell that land he has in Pomerania and his pictures," continued Rex, "or else one of his houses in Berlin. With a little cunning we could manage it. For the time being the checkbook answers the purpose admirably. He signs everything like a machine, but his bank account will soon run dry. We must hurry up, too. It would be nice to leave him, say, this winter, and before we go, we'll buy him a dog, as a small token of our gratitude." "Don't talk so loud," said Margot. "We're at the stone already." This stone, a large grey one, which was overgrown with convolvulus, and looked like a sheep, marked the boundary beyond which it was dangerous to talk at all. So they walked on in silence, and after a few minutes were near the garden gate. Margot laughed suddenly and pointed to a squirrel. Rex chucked a stone at the animal, but missed it. "Oh, kill it, they do a lot of damage to the trees," said Margot softly. "Who does damage to the trees?" asked a loud voice. It was Albinus, who was standing rocking slightly among the syringa shrubs on a little stone step which led from the footpath onto the lawn. "Margot, whom are you talking to down there?" he went on. Suddenly he stumbled, dropped his stick, and sat down heavily on the step. "How dare you wander so far by yourself?" she exclaimed, and seizing him roughly, she helped him to get up. Some little bits of gravel had stuck to his hand. He spread out his fingers and tried to rub the gravel off, as a child might do. "I wanted to catch a squirrel," declared Margot, thrusting the stick into his hand. "What did you think I was doing?" "I fancied," Albinus began. "Who's there?" he cried sharply, nearly losing his balance again as he veered in the direction of Rex, who was cautiously walking across the lawn. "There's no one here," said Margot. "I'm alone. Why are you in such a state?" She felt her patience going. Lead me back to the house," he said, almost in tears. "There are too many sounds here, trees, wind, squirrels, and things I cannot name. I don't know what's happening around me. It's all so noisy. From now on you shall be shut in," she said, and dragged him into the house. Then, as usual, the sun went down behind the neighboring ridge. As usual, Margot and Rex sat side by side on the sofa and smoked, and half a dozen feet away from them sat Albinus in his leather armchair, staring at them fixedly with his milky blue eyes. At his request, Margot told him about her childhood. She rather liked doing it. He went to bed early, slowly climbing the staircase and feeling for every step with a toe and stick. In the middle of the night, he woke up and fingered the unglazed dial of an alarm clock until he found out the position of the hands. It was about 1:30. He was filled with a strange uneasiness. Of late something had hindered him from concentrating on those grave and beautiful thoughts which alone were capable of shielding him against the horrors of blindness. He lay and thought, "What is it, Elizabeth? No, she is far away. She is very far below. Somewhere. A dear, pale, sorrowful shade which I must never disturb. Margot? No, this brother and sister state of things is only for the time being. What is it, then?" Without quite knowing what he wanted, he crept out of bed and groped his way to Margot's door. His room had no other exit. She always locked it at night, and so he was shut in. "How wise she is," he thought tenderly, and put his ear to the keyhole, hoping to hear her breathing in her sleep, but he heard nothing. "Quiet as a little mouse," he whispered. "If I could just stroke her head and then go away. Perhaps she has forgotten to lock the door." Without much hope, he pressed the latch. No, she had not forgotten. He suddenly remembered how one sultry summer night, when he was a pimply youth, he had clambered along the cornice of a house on the Rhine from his room into that of the housemaid, only to find that she was not sleeping alone. But at that time he was light and nimble. At that time he could see. "Still, why should I not try?" he thought with a melancholy daring. "And if I do fall and break my neck, will it matter?" First he found a stick, leaned out of the window, and groped with it to the left over the sill to the neighboring window. It was open, and the pane twinkled as the stick touched it. "How fast asleep she is," he thought. "Must be exhausting looking after me all day long." As he drew back the stick, he caught it on something. It slipped from his grasp and fell to the ground below with a faint thud. Albinus held on to the window frame, clambered out onto the sill, made his way to the left along the cornice, clutching at what was presumably a water pipe, stepped across its cold iron bend, and clutched the window sill of the next room. How simple, he thought, not without pride. "And hello, Margot," he said softly, trying to crawl in through the open window. He slipped and almost fell backward into the abstraction of the garden. His heart was beating violently. He wriggled over the sill into the room, and some heavy object which he displaced fell to the ground noisily. He stood still. His face was covered with sweat. On his hand he felt something sticky. It was rosin, which had oozed out of the pine wood of which the house was built. "Margot, darling," he said cheerfully. Silence. He found the bed. It was covered with a lace spread, had not yet been slept in. Albinus seated himself on it and reflected. If the bed had been open and warm, then it would have been easy to understand. She would be back in a moment. After a few moments he went out into the corridor, much hampered by the absence of his stick, and listened. He fancied that he heard somewhere a low smothered sound, something between a creak and a rustle. It began to be uncanny. He called out, "Margot, where are you?" Everything remained silent. Then a door opened. "Margot, Margot," he repeated, groping his way down this corridor. Yes, I'm here," her voice answered calmly. "What's happened, Margot? Why haven't you gone to bed?" She collided with him in the dark passage, and when he touched her, he felt that she was undressed. "I was lying in the sun," she said, "as I always do in the morning, but now it's night," he explained, breathing heavily. "I can't understand. There's something wrong somewhere. I know it because I felt the hands of the clock. It's 1:30. Rob, it's just 6:30 in a lovely sunny morning. Your clock must have gone wrong. You feel the hands too often, but look here. How did you get out of your room? Margot, is it really morning? Are you telling the truth?" But suddenly went up close to him, and standing on tiptoe, laid her arms around his neck as she had done in the old days. "Although it's day," she said softly. If you like, dearest, as a great exception." She did not much want to do it, but it was the only way. Now Albinus could no longer notice that the air was still cold, that no birds were singing, for he felt only one thing, fierce, fiery bliss, and then he sank into a deep sleep and slept until midday. When he woke up, Margot scolded him for his climbing exploit, was still more furious when she saw his melancholy smile and slapped his cheek. The whole of that day he sat in the drawing-room, thinking of his happy morning and wondering how many days it would be before this happiness would be repeated. All of a sudden, quite distinctly, he heard someone emit a dubious little cough. That could not be Margot. He knew she was in the kitchen. "Who's there?" he asked, but no one answered. Another hallucination, thought Albinus wearily, and then all at once he understood what it was that had worried him so at night. Yes, it was strange noises, which he sometimes heard. "Tell me, Margot," he said, as she came back. "Is there no one in the house besides Amelia? Are you quite sure?" "You nut," she answered curtly. But once his suspicion had been roused, it refused to give him any rest. He sat still all day and listened gloomily. Rex was very much amused at this, and although Margot had besought him to be more prudent, he paid no heed to her warning. Once, even when he was only 2 feet away from Albinus, he very skillfully began to whistle like an oriole. Margot had to explain that the bird had perched on the window-sill and was singing there. "Drive it away," said Albinus sternly. "Shh, shh," said Margot, laying her hand on Rex's fat lips. "Do you know," said Albinus a few days later, "I should like to have a chat with Amelia. I like her puddings." "Absolutely out of the question," answered Margot. "She is quite deaf and mortally afraid of you." Albinus thought hard for some minutes. "Impossible," he said slowly. "What's impossible, Albert?" "Oh, nothing," he muttered. "Nothing." "Do you know, Margot," he said shortly afterward, "I'm badly in need of a shave. Send for the hairdresser from the village." "Unnecessary," said Margot. "The beard suits you very well." Albinus fancied that someone, not Margot, but someone by the side of Margot, tittered softly. 37. The Berliner Zeitung. With a brief account of the accident was shown to Paul by a man in his office, and he at once drove home, fearing that Elizabeth had read it too. She had not, though curiously enough, a copy of that particular paper, which they did not usually read was in the house. He wired the same day to the Grosset police station, and eventually got into touch with the hospital doctor, who replied saying that Albinus was out of danger, but quite blind. Very gently he broke the news to Elizabeth. Then, owing to the simple fact that he and his brother-in-law both had the same bank, he discovered Albinus's address in Switzerland. The manager, an old business friend of his, showed him the checks that were pouring in from there with a kind of hasty regularity, and Paul was amazed at the amount of cash Albinus was drawing out. The signature was all right, though very shaky about the curves and pathetically drawn sloping. But the figures were written in another hand, a bold masculine hand with a dash and a flourish, and there was somehow a faint whiff of forgery about the whole thing. He wondered whether it was the fact of the blind man signing what he was told, not what he saw, that created this queer impression. Queer, too, were the large sums he demanded, as if he or somebody else were in a frantic hurry to get out as much money as he could. Then came a check that was uncovered. "There's some foul business going on," thought Paul. "I feel it in my bones. And what is it exactly?" He pictured to himself Albinus alone with his dangerous mistress, completely at her mercy in the black house of his blindness. Some days passed. Paul was dreadfully uneasy. It was not the mere fact of the man signing checks he could not see. Anyway, the money was his to squander consciously or unconsciously. Elizabeth did not need it, and there was no longer any Irma to be thought about. But the fact of his being so utterly helpless in the wicked world that he had let grow up around him. One evening, as Paul came home, he found Elizabeth packing a portmanteau. He was curious that she looked happier than she had done for many months. "What's up?" he asked. "Are you going anywhere?" "You are," she said quietly. The next day, Paul traveled to Switzerland. At Brigard, he took a taxi, and in something over an hour, reached the little town above which Albinus was living. Paul stopped in front of the post office, and a very talkative young woman in charge of the latter told him the way to the chalet, and added that Albinus was staying there with his niece and doctor. Paul drove out immediately. He knew who the niece was, but in the presence of the doctor surprised him. It seemed to suggest that Albinus was being better looked after than might be supposed. "Perhaps, after all, I've come here on a fool's errand," thought Paul uncomfortably. "He may be quite contented, but now that I'm here, well, anyway, I'll have a talk with his doctor. Poor fellow, a shattered life, who could have thought?" That morning, Margot had gone to the village with Amelia. She did not notice Paul's taxi, but at the post office she was told that a stout gentleman had just inquired after Albinus, and he had driven up to see him. At this moment, Albinus and Rex were seated opposite one another in the little drawing-room, into which the sunlight was streaming through the glass door leading to the terrace. Rex sat on a folding stool. He was stark naked. As a result of his daily sunbaths, his lean but robust body, with on its breast black hair in the shape of a spread eagle, was tanned a deep brown. Between his full red lips he held a long stalk of grass, and with his hairy legs crossed and his chin cupped on his hand, rather in the pose of Rodin's thinker, he was staring at Albinus, who in return seemed to be gazing at him quite as intently. The blind man was wearing an ample mouse-gray dressing-gown, and his bearded face expressed agonized tension. He was listening. Of late he had done nothing else but listen. Rex knew this, and was watching how the man's thoughts were mirrored on his face, as if that face had become one big eye since its actual pair of eyes had gone. One or two little tests might add to the fun. He slapped his knee softly, and Albinus, who had just raised his hand to his knitted brow, remained transfixed with uplifted arm. Then Rex bent slowly forward and touched Albinus's forehead very gently with the flowering end of a grass stem. which he had just been sucking. Albinus sighed strangely and brushed away the imaginary fly. Rex tickled his lips, and again Albinus made that helpless movement. This was good fun indeed. Suddenly the blind man cocked his head abruptly. Rex too turned, and through the glass door he saw a stout gentleman in his checkered cap, whose red face he recognized at once, and who was standing there on the terrace and looking on in amazement. Rex put his finger to his lips and made a sign to him, meaning that he would join him in a moment, but the other pushed open the door and stepped into the room. "Of course I know you. Your name is Rex," said Paul, taking a deep breath and staring at this naked man, who still smiled and held his finger to his lips. Albinus had meanwhile risen to his feet. The reddish hue of his scarf seemed to have spread over his whole forehead. Suddenly he began to scream and jabber, and only gradually words formed themselves out of these jagged words. "Paul, I'm here alone," he cried. "Paul, do say that I'm alone. That man is in America. He is not here. Paul, I implore you, I'm quite blind." "Pity you've spoiled everything," said Rex, and then he ran out and began mounting the stairs. Paul seized the blind man's stick, caught up with Rex, who turned round and held up his hands to protect himself, and Paul, good-natured Paul, who had never in his life hit a living creature, swung out mightily at Rex's hand and got it with a tremendous bang. Rex leaped back, his face still twisted in a smile, and suddenly something very remarkable occurred. Like Adam after the fall, Rex, cowering by the white wall and grinning wanly, covered his nakedness with his hand. Paul rushed after him again, but the man dodged and ran up the steps. At this moment someone fell upon Paul from behind. It was Albinus, clutching, whimpering, and holding a marble letter-weight in his hand. "Paul," he groaned, "Paul, I understand everything. Give me my overcoat, quick. It's hanging in the wardrobe there." "Which, the yellow one?" asked Paul, struggling for his breath. Albinus immediately felt what he wanted in the pocket, and he stopped blubbering. "I'll take you away from here at once," panted Paul. "Take off your dressing gown and put on that coat. Give me that letter-weight. Come on, I'll help you. There, take my cap. It doesn't matter that you've only got bedroom slippers on. Let's get away, Albert. I've got a taxi down there. The first thing to be done is to get you out of this torture chamber." "Wait a bit," said Albinus. "I must speak to her first. She must be back in a moment." "I must, Paul. It won't take long." But Paul pushed him out into the garden, and then shouted and beckoned to the chauffeur. "I must speak to her," repeated Albinus, quite close. "For God's sake, Paul, tell me. Perhaps she's here already? Perhaps she's come back?" "No, calm yourself. We must go. There's no one here. Only that naked wretch looking out for the window." "Come on, Albert, come on." "Yes, we'll go," said Albinus, "but you must tell me if you see her. We may meet her on the way. Then I must speak to her. Quite close, quite close." They went down the footpath, but after a few steps Albinus suddenly opened his arms and fell back in a swoon. The taxi driver came hurrying up, and together they lifted Albinus into the car. Out of the slippers remained there on the footpath. At that moment a trap drove up, and Margot jumped out of it. She ran toward them and shouted something, but the car was already turning in the road. It almost knocked her down as it backed. Then it lurched forward and disappeared round the bend. On Tuesday, Elizabeth received a telegram, and about 8 on Wednesday night she heard Paul's voice in the hall, and the pat-pat of a stick. The door opened, and Paul led in her husband. He was clean-shaven. He was wearing dark spectacles. There was a scar on his pale forehead. The unfamiliar purplish-brown suit, a shade he had never chosen himself, seemed rather too large for him. "Here he is," said Paul quietly. Elizabeth began to sob, pressing her handkerchief to her mouth. Albinus bowed silently in the direction of the smothered sobbing. "Come along, we'll wash our hands," said Paul, leading him slowly across the room. Then the three of them sat in the dining room and had supper. Elizabeth had difficulty in accustoming herself to look at her husband. It seemed to her that he felt her glance. The melancholy gravity of his slow movements filled her with a tranquil ecstasy of pity. Paul talked to him as though he were a child, and cut up the ham on his plate into little pieces. He was given what had been Irma's nursery. It surprised Elizabeth. She found it so easy to disturb the sacred slumber of that little room for the sake of this strange, large, silent occupant, to shift and change all its contents so as to adapt it to the blind man's needs. Albinus said nothing at first, to be sure. While they were still in Switzerland, he had begged Paul with petulant persistency to ask Margot to come and see him. He had sworn that this final meeting would not last more than a moment, and indeed would it take long to grope in the wonted darkness, and holding her tightly with one hand, to thrust the barrel of the automatic against her side and stuff her with bullets? Paul had obstinately refused to do as he asked, and after that Albinus had said nothing. He traveled to Berlin in silence. He arrived in silence, and he was silent for the next 3 days, so that Elizabeth never heard his voice any more, except perhaps once. He might have been dumb as well as blind. The heavy black object, the treasure house of 7 composed deaths, lay wrapped in his silk muffler in the depths of his overcoat pocket. Then, when he arrived, he managed to transfer it to a chest of drawers near his bed. He kept the key in his waistcoat pocket and put it under the pillow at night. Once or twice they noticed that he was fumbling and clutching something at his head, but no comments were made. The touch of that key against his palm, its light weight in his pocket, seemed to him a kind of sesame that would, he was certain of it, one day unlock the door of his blindness. And he had still not said a word. Elizabeth's presence, her light tread, her whispering. She always spoke to the servants and to Paul in a whisper now, as if there were great sickness in the house, were just as pale and shadowy as was his memory of her. It was almost soundless memory, drifting about listlessly with a faint trail of eau de cologne, that was all. Real life which was cruel, supple, and strong like that of an anaconda, and which he longed to destroy without delay, was somewhere else, but where? He did not know. With extraordinary distinctness he pictured Margot and Rex, both quick and alert, with terrible, beaming, goggled eyes, and long, lithe limbs. Packing after his departure, Margot fawned and caressed Rex among the open trunks, and then they both went away. But where? Where? Not a light in the darkness. But their sinuous path burned in him, like the trace which a foul, crawling creature leaves on the skin. 3 silent days passed. On the 4th, early in the morning, it so happened that Albinus was alone. Paul had just gone to the police. There were certain things which he wanted to elucidate. The maid was back room, and Elizabeth, who had not slept all night, was not yet up. Albinus wandered about in an agony of restlessness, fingering the furniture and the doors. For some time the telephone had been ringing in the study, and this reminded him that there was by this means the possibility of getting certain information. Someone might tell him whether the artist Rex was back in Berlin, but he could not remember a single telephone number, and he knew, moreover, that he would not be able to pronounce that name in spite of its shortness. The ringing became more and more insistent. Albinus found his way to the table, took up the invisible receiver. A voice which seemed to him familiar asked for Herr Ochemort. That is for Paul. He is out, answered Albinus. The voice hesitated, then suddenly exclaimed brightly, Why, is it you, Herr Albinus? Yes, and who are you? Schiffer Miller. I just rang up Herr Hochwart's office, but he had not yet arrived, so I thought I'd get him here. How lucky my getting you, Herr Albinus. What's the matter? Asked Albinus. Well, probably it's quite all right, but I thought my duty was to make quite sure. You see, Fraulein Peters has just come to fetch some things, and, well, I let her into your flat, but I don't quite know. So I thought I'd better— That's all right, said Albinus, moving his lips with difficulty. They felt numb as though from cocaine. What did you say, Herr Albinus? Albinus made a great effort to conquer speech. That's all right, he repeated distinctly, and hung up with a trembling hand. He blundered back into his room, unlocked the sacred chest, then went groping into the hall and tried to find his hat and stick, but that took too long, and he gave up. Cautiously he padded and shuffled his way down the stairs, clutching the banisters and muttering to himself feverishly. In a few moments he was standing in the street. Something cold and tickling was dripping on his forehead. Rain. He held on to the iron railing of the front garden and desperately prayed for the sound of the taxi horn. Soon he heard the moist, leisurely swish of tires. He shouted, but the sound moved away unheedingly. May I help you cross? Asked a pleasant young voice. For heaven's sake, get me a cab, implored Albinus. Once more the sound of tires approached. Someone helped him into the taxi and slammed the door. A window opened to the 4th story, but it was too late. Straight ahead, said Albinus softly, and when the taxi was once more in motion, he tapped with his finger on the glass and gave the address. I'll count the turnings, thought Albinus. The first one, this will be Mollstrasse. To the left he heard the shrill jingle of the electric tram. Albinus passed his hand over the seat. The front partition and the floor, suddenly disquieted by the thought that someone might be sitting beside him. Another turning. This must be the Victoria Luisenplatz or the Pragerplatz. In a moment he would be at the Kaiserallee. The taxi stopped. Am I really there already? It can't be. It's only a crossroad. It must be at least another 5 minutes, but the door opened. This is number 56, said the taxi driver. Albinus stepped out of the taxi. Through the air in front of him arose cheerfully a complete edition of the voice which he had just heard on the telephone. Schiffer Miller, the house porter, said, Glad to see you again, Herr Albinus. The young lady's upstairs in your flat. She— Hush, hush, whispered Albinus. Pray the taxi, please. My eyes are— His knee hit against something which wobbled and jingled, probably a child's bicycle on the pavement. Lead me into the house, he said. Give me the key of the flat. Quick, please. And now take me to the lift. No, you can stay downstairs. I'll go up alone. I'll press the button myself.